Picture a city at the height of its power. Constantinople, Cairo, Baghdad. It does not matter which one. Pick any great city of the medieval world and the image is the same. Grain ships docking at the waterfront. Markets packed from sunrise to dark. Streets full of people pressing against each other, shouting over animals, stepping around carts. Tens of thousands of human beings living inside walls, sharing wells, breathing the same air, sleeping in the same quarters above the same flooded gutters. The city was alive. It was trade, wealth, architecture, scholarship, faith. It was the most sophisticated human project the age had produced. And then one morning, a ship docked that should not have docked. One sailor stumbled onto the pier. A few days later, his neighbors fell ill. Within weeks, the bodies were in the streets. The plague or cholera or typhus moved through the city the way fire moves through dry grass. Not because the people were weak, not because the physicians were incompetent, but because the city itself had been built, without anyone realizing it, as the perfect engine for transmitting disease. Now travel 2 days by horse from those walls. Find a small Bedouin camp in the open desert. 15, maybe 30 people. No physician, no pharmacy, no walls, no sewage system. Not even a permanent address. The epidemic never arrived. Not because the desert people were tougher, not because they were blessed, not because they had discovered a medicine the city physicians had missed. The epidemic never arrived because it could not find what it needed to survive. Enough people, close enough together, long enough, sharing the same contaminated water. The desert did not protect them. The city killed everyone else. That is the mystery this story is about. Not ancient wisdom, not mystical desert knowledge. Something stranger than that. How did a way of life shaped entirely by hardship and movement accidentally become one of the most effective epidemic prevention systems in human history, while the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth kept dying in? Waves? If you want to understand it, you have to stop thinking about medicine. You have to start thinking about structure. Every great epidemic, when you trace it back through the historical record, needs the same things to survive and spread. It needs bodies, lots of them, close together. It needs the bodies to stay close together long enough for the chain of transmission to complete itself. And it needs a pathway, a shared surface, a shared fluid, a shared breath that connects one body to the next. Medieval cities were perfect for all three. Start with the rats. A city needs grain. Grain stores attract rats. Rats carry fleas. Fleas carry Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The flea does not care about politics or theology or architecture. It needs a warm body. And in a city of 50,000 people sleeping in close quarters, grain stores stacked against residential walls, markets mixing livestock and humans in the same alleyways, it found warm bodies everywhere. It did not need to travel. The city delivered hosts to the flea. That was plague. But plague was only one of the killers. The others did not need rats at all. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, these traveled in water. Specifically, they traveled in water that had been contaminated by human waste. The mechanism was simple and devastating. A city of 50,000 people produces enormous quantities of fecal matter every single day. In a pre-modern city, that waste had nowhere to go. It seeped into the ground. It ran into drainage ditches. It collected in cesspools dug beneath or beside residential buildings. And those cesspools sat a few feet from the wells that the same households used for drinking water. The contamination was not a product of individual carelessness. It was a product of structural inevitability. You cannot concentrate 50,000 people inside walls without also concentrating 50,000 people's waste. There was no solution that pre-modern engineering could fully manage. In Copenhagen in 1853, the city's water supply ran through hollow wooden pipes that sat underground, directly beside the cesspools they were never adequately separated from. The sewage seeped. The water picked it up. Cholera killed thousands. Nobody had intended it. The city's infrastructure, the very infrastructure built to supply water to its residents, had become the transmission route. London, 1 year later. A physician named John Snow traced a cholera outbreak not to bad air or moral failure, as most of his contemporaries assumed, but to a single public well on Broad Street. One contaminated pump, one neighborhood drinking from it daily, hundreds dead. The contamination came from a nearby cesspool that had leaked into the groundwater beneath the pump. One well, one leak. An entire community infected through the shared infrastructure they depended on to survive. Here is the detail that most accounts skip over. The city did not fail because its people were dirty or ignorant. The city failed because concentration makes contamination catastrophic. A single contaminated source, shared by thousands, becomes a catastrophic event. A single sick animal in a grain store, surrounded by rats, becomes a citywide outbreak. The city's great strength, its ability to concentrate people, trade, and resources, was also the mechanism of its most lethal weakness. So now the question becomes, what does the Bedouin camp look like through exactly this lens? Not through the lens of medicine, not through the lens of immunity or toughness or divinely favored people. Through the lens of structure. How many people? How close? How long did they stay? What did they share? The answer to all of those questions was different from the city in every meaningful way. A Bedouin camp in the pre-modern desert was not a village. It was not a settlement. It was not even a fixed address in the modern sense. It was a group of perhaps 15 to 40 people, sometimes fewer, moving through the landscape in response to water, pasture, and season. They moved not for adventure, but for necessity. The land demanded it. When the pasture was exhausted or the well ran low, the camp moved. When the season shifted, the route shifted. The movement was not random. It was an inherited and carefully maintained logic. But the result, from the perspective of epidemic transmission, was something no medieval city could replicate. When the camp moved, it left behind the accumulated waste of the previous days. Not in a system, not through engineering, simply by leaving. The next camp was built on ground that had not yet been contaminated. The people were not sleeping above last month's latrine. They were not drinking from a well contaminated by the waste of the 10,000 people who had used it before them. They moved on before the contamination could complete the loop. Think about what this meant for the transmission chain. Bubonic plague needs enough rats, enough fleas, and enough warm human bodies within close enough range over enough time for the chain to sustain itself. A camp of 30 people, spread across open ground, moving every few days to a new location, breaks every one of those conditions simultaneously. There are not enough bodies. They are not close enough together, they do not stay long enough, and they are not producing the concentrated grain stores that draw rats in the first place. Cholera needs a contaminated water source shared by enough people, for long enough, in a fixed location. A group of 20 people using a well for 3 to 4 days does not generate the contamination volume that a city of 10,000 generates in a single week of permanent occupation. And when they leave the risk behind them. This was not strategy. Nobody in that camp was thinking about transmission chains or fecal-oral contamination or flea biology. They were thinking about water, pasture, and distance. But the effect, seen from outside, was the same as if they had designed a public health system from scratch. Ottoman-era sources from 18th century Syria record something that confirms this logic almost too cleanly. When Bedouin groups visited urban markets during the grain harvest, when the crowds were thickest and the temperatures highest, their rates of illness rose. They were the same people, with the same bodies, the same diet, the same habits. The difference was not in them. The difference was in the structure they had temporarily entered. When they stepped inside the city's transmission network, they stepped inside the city's risk. The protection was never in their blood. It was in their distance. That one detail is worth sitting with, because it destroys a comfortable misunderstanding. The Bedouin was not biologically protected. He was structurally protected. Remove the structure, and the protection disappeared. The desert did not make people immune to disease. Immunity, in the biological sense, was not the point. The point was that the daily logic of nomadic life, the movement, the spacing, the temporary use of water sources, the small group sizes made the city's most lethal epidemics structurally impossible to sustain. But dispersal explains only part of the story. Plague spread through rats and fleas. That chain broke in the open desert. But cholera and dysentery are different. They travel in water, and water was not something Bedouins could simply avoid. So the question shifts. If the city's water killed it, what was different about the water the desert camp drank? The answer begins not with the water itself, but with the relationship to it. A medieval city did not merely use water. It lived inside water permanently, collectively, inescapably. The well sat at the center of the neighborhood. Thousands of people drew from it every morning. The cesspools sat a few feet away, year after year, seeping slowly downward through the same soil the well drew from. The contamination was not an accident waiting to happen. It was a process already happening, continuously, invisibly, beneath the stones. Now picture the nomadic camp at a well. 20, perhaps 30 people, their animals. A few days of rest before the next movement. They draw water, they water the animals, they fill the skins, and then they leave. The well remains. But the waste generated by 30 people over 3 days is not the same as the waste generated by 10,000 people over 30 years. The contamination does not have time to accumulate. The loop does not close. This was not sanitation engineering. Nobody planned it. It was simply the arithmetic of movement applied to a problem that stationary populations had no way to solve. The city could not leave its well. The camp could. And in that one difference, compounded over decades and generations, lived an enormous gap in epidemic outcomes. There is a line in the history of cholera that makes this concrete. When John Snow traced the Broad Street outbreak in 1854, he was not discovering that dirty water caused disease. People had suspected that for centuries. He was proving that a single contaminated source, shared by a concentrated population, could kill hundreds in days. The pump handle was famously removed. The outbreak slowed. One handle, one well, one neighborhood. The intervention worked because the city's disease traveled through infrastructure it had no choice but to share. The nomadic camp had no shared infrastructure in that sense. Each campsite was new. Each water stop was temporary. The accidental elegance of the system was that it never allowed the contamination cycle to reach the scale at which it became catastrophic. Small exposure, short duration, then movement. Not zero risk, but a structurally different order of risk. And here is where modern people make the same mistake, assuming that more infrastructure automatically means more safety. The city had more wells, more physicians, more walls, more grain, more everything. It also had more dead. The infrastructure that connected people to resources also connected people to each other's pathogens. The desert camp had almost nothing, but what it lacked in infrastructure, it gained in separation. The waste logic follows the same pattern. Dense, permanent populations generate waste that accumulates in place. Flies breed in it. Rats nest near it. Runoff carries it toward water sources. The city, again, had no structural solution. The camp simply walked away, not out of wisdom, out of necessity. The pasture was exhausted. The season had shifted. The route demanded movement. The waste stayed. The people moved forward. The city built up its own poison. The desert camp walked away from it. That line is not a metaphor. It is a description of a documented epidemiological difference. But it would be dishonest to stop there. Before you conclude that the desert was paradise, it wasn't. Bedouins were not healthy by any modern definition of the word. Trachoma was common, a bacterial eye infection spread by flies and direct contact that caused widespread visual impairment across desert populations. Intestinal parasites were real and persistent. Infant mortality was high. Physical injuries from the environment, cuts, infections, animal wounds, exposure were constant. Dehydration was always close. The desert had its own killers, and they were not gentle. The honest and narrow claim is this: Bedouins were structurally protected from the specific epidemic diseases that destroyed cities. Plague, cholera, typhus, the mass killers of the pre-modern world required conditions that the nomadic camp structurally could not provide. It was not that the desert people never suffered. It was that they could not suffer in the particular way that wiped out 30% of a continent in 5 years. They did not escape disease. They escaped the particular diseases that destroyed cities. Now add the third layer, and this one is subtler than dispersal or water. Camel milk was a staple of the Bedouin diet, not a supplement, not an occasional food, but a primary source of nutrition across long stretches of the year. Modern laboratory research has found that camel milk contains higher concentrations of lactoferrin than bovine milk. Lactoferrin is a protein with documented antimicrobial properties. It binds iron that bacteria need to replicate, and it disrupts certain bacterial cell membranes. Camel milk also contains lysozyme, immunoglobulins, and other bioactive compounds. Fermented camel milk, which Bedouins consumed regularly, shows measurable antibacterial activity against E. coli, Staphylococcus aureus, and Salmonella in laboratory studies. This does not mean camel milk was a cure. It does not mean it was a vaccine. The mechanisms are documented in labs, but have not been fully traced in field conditions or historical populations. Frame it carefully. In a context where food safety was otherwise precarious, where water quality was variable, and where gut infections were a constant background threat, a dietary staple with inherent antimicrobial properties may have offered a partial, quiet, unintentional layer of protection. Not a shield, a friction in the transmission chain. The desert environment added something too. Dry air and high UV exposure reduce the survival time of pathogens on surfaces and in exposed water. A bacterium sitting on a wet stone in a humid city survives far longer than one sitting on dry desert sand under direct sun. This was not a protection Bedouins designed. It was a condition the landscape provided, but it contributed to the same structural outcome. The desert was, for purely physical and environmental reasons, a more hostile place for certain pathogens than a city was. Then there was the livestock question. Settled agricultural communities concentrated large numbers of animals in fixed pens, year after year, in close contact with human populations. That proximity is one of the principal mechanisms by which animal pathogens cross into human hosts. Bedouin herds moved with the camp. They did not accumulate in permanent enclosures beside permanent human habitations. The risk was real. People lived closely with their animals, but the pattern of crowding that amplifies zoonotic transmission in settled farming was structurally different from the nomadic model. None of this was intentional. Not one layer of this system was designed by a physician or a public health administrator or a philosopher. It emerged from the demands of a landscape that punished sedentary behavior and rewarded movement. The Bedouin did not study epidemiology. The Bedouin followed the water, followed the pasture, followed the season, and in doing so, accidentally constructed a way of life that was structurally incompatible with the transmission chains that killed city populations by the millions. Civilization concentrated people. Concentration concentrated pathogens. The Bedouin did not build civilization, and in not building it, accidentally built a different kind of protection. Every great epidemic in the pre-modern historical record traces back to a city or through a city. Constantinople and the plague of Justinian in the 6th century. The Black Death moving through Mediterranean port cities in 1347 before spreading inland along trade routes. Cholera erupting from the Ganges Delta and reaching Europe through the crowded slums of industrializing cities. The pattern is consistent across centuries, continents, and diseases. Cities were where the die-offs happened. Cities were where the transmission chains found the density they needed to become catastrophes. Every one of those cities had something the desert camp lacked. Walls, permanence, 50,000 people sharing water drawn from the same contaminated ground, grain stores full of rats, markets where livestock and humans pressed against each other daily, shared sleeping quarters in which a single infected person could begin a chain that would run through an entire neighborhood before anyone understood what was happening. The desert camp had almost none of it, and so the plague came to the ports, moved through the markets, killed a third of the population of a continent, and 2 days' ride away, in a camp of 30 people that would be somewhere else by next week. The chain could not hold. Now the image comes back. The ship docked. The sailor stumbled onto the pier. The city, with all its wealth and walls and physicians, could not stop what was already moving through its shared water and its crowded sleeping quarters and its grain stores thick with rats. It never could, because stopping it would have required dismantling the very density that made it a city. And in the desert, at night, the campfires burned far apart from each other. The animals settled. The stars came out over a landscape that looked, to any observer from the city, like nothing, empty, bare, stripped of everything that made civilization worthwhile. No physician, no wall, no pharmacy, no permanent water source shared with 10,000 others, no grain store, No cesspool seeping into the soil beneath a crowded neighborhood. No flea moving from a dying rat through a sleeping family. Just movement, spacing, temporary use of water. Waste left behind as the camp moved forward. 30 people under open sky, consuming milk from animals that carried their own quiet biology, breathing air that shortened pathogen survival, drinking from wells they would leave in 3 days. The silence of the desert was never emptiness. It was, without anyone intending it, a kind of immunity. Not in the blood, in the structure, in the daily logic of a life shaped entirely by a landscape that did not allow permanence, did not reward crowding, and did not forgive the kind of accumulation that cities built their greatness upon. You thought this was poverty. Every outsider who looked at that camp thought this was poverty. No walls, no physicians, no fixed address, nothing. What they were looking at was the accidental architecture of survival, refined not by intention but by the simple, brutal arithmetic of a landscape that had been eliminating the mistakes for generations before anyone thought to ask why the cities kept dying and the camps did not.